The sound of boots on frozen ground echoed through the dim twilight of a collapsing Europe. In March 1945, near the edges of the Ruhr Pocket, a column of German nurses shuffled forward under the watch of armed American guards. Their white aprons were stained with weeks of field duty, their hands raw from bandaging men who would never leave the battlefield alive. They were prisoners now, marched through a world that told them defeat was final. Their minds rehearsed the inevitable interrogation, contempt, perhaps abandonment in some drafty barrack where their medical training would mean nothing. But then the unexpected happened, inside a canvas tent pitched among ruined farmhouses. An American officer, Major John Whitaker of the U.S. Army Medical Corps, didn't bark orders or demand confessions. Instead, he thrust forward masks and gloves. His words sliced through the silence with a shocking clarity. "Scrub in. We need you." The German women froze, their thoughts colliding against this contradiction. They had been prepared to defend their dignity against scorn. Instead, they were invited to cross an invisible line, from captive to colleague, from enemy to healer. It was not a question, but a command, not delivered with cruelty, but with the calm urgency of a surgeon staring down time itself. The paradox struck like a lightning bolt in the heart of total war, where hatred seemed bottomless. The victors extended a role of responsibility, not to harm, but to save, not to shame, but to share. The tent reeked of blood and ether, but the greater shock came from this new battlefield, one where scalpels, clamps, and sutures replaced rifles and grenades. For the nurses, the contradiction was suffocating. They had sworn loyalty to a regime that had taught them Americans were monsters. Yet here was a man in a white coat treating them not as enemies, but as skilled professionals. Even the guards outside, rifles slung and cigarettes glowing in the dusk, looked uneasy, as though they too struggled to grasp what was unfolding. It was a scene so surreal that later, one nurse would recall in her diary that she felt as though the ground itself had split. "I expected a cell. Instead, I was handed gloves. My hands trembled more than in any bombardment. That trembling carried a question deeper than survival. Why would the conquerors, with all their power, choose to let the defeated help preserve life? This was the paradox of war and medicine. On one field, men tore each other apart. On another, only yards away, the same nations collaborated to keep a single heart beating. The question hangs for us now. As it did for them then, why would the victors hand their enemy the chance to save, not destroy? The war's final winter was merciless. By late 1944 and into the spring of 1945, the Allied advance pushed deep into Germany, collapsing every remaining pocket of resistance. With each battle came a tidal wave of broken bodies. The U.S. Army Medical Corps faced an overwhelming crisis. Field hospitals set up in barns, schools, and church halls overflowed. On some days, more than 2,000 wounded men arrived at a single Corps station along the Rhine. Surgeons worked around the clock, operating on stretchers placed end to end on muddy floors. The shortage of personnel grew desperate. According to official records, by April 1945, nearly 11,000 American medical workers were scattered across the European theater. Yet the number of patients needing attention regularly dwarfed available staff. Supplies thinned, and surgical teams doubled shifts, their hands blistered from endless scrubbing and stitching. The front lines of medicine began to look as chaotic as the front lines of combat. At the same time, the Allied armies captured thousands of German military staff, not only soldiers, but also trained nurses who had been stationed at collapsing Wehrmacht hospitals. These women, many in their 20s, had tended to shattered soldiers under relentless air raids. When captured, they expected the cold indifference of a victor, yet in places like Remagen, Koblenz, and Cologne, U.S. commanders faced a paradoxical calculation: ignore these nurses and let their skills waste, or enlist their expertise to handle the flood of wounded. Some American doctors protested at first. Could they truly trust women who had worn the insignia of the Reich only hours before rumors rippled through the camps? One officer claimed he overheard a nurse whisper a hymn for fallen German soldiers while scrubbing instruments. Another swore the prisoners exchanged gossip about American rations, how even a guard's lunchbox contained more meat than a month's ration back home in Bavaria. These small observations spread quickly, fueling curiosity and unease alike. The numbers made the decision inevitable. At one camp near Aachen, for every American surgeon there were 30 wounded men awaiting surgery, without extra hands. Many would bleed out before dawn, so orders came down. The German nurses would be put to work, not as free women, not as equals, but neither as humiliated prisoners. They would stand beside Americans under the harsh glare of surgical lamps, their skill now pressed into a cause they had never imagined. Letters written by U.S. medics reveal their surprise. A corporal described the moment one blonde-haired German nurse, her apron still marked with a Red Cross armband, calmly tied sutures on an American infantryman. It was madness. He wrote, "We called her a prisoner, yet in that hour she was the reason he lived." In the barracks, whispers turned to questions. How could the conquerors allow the conquered to touch their wounded? Would the Germans sabotage the work, or would professional pride overcome politics? The stage was set for a collision not of weapons, but of expectations. And so, as the wounded piled higher and the operating tents glowed deep into the night, the strange alliance of necessity was born. The Americans needed hands. The Germans had hands trained for healing. What neither side yet understood was how this fragile arrangement would unsettle the deepest assumptions of war. For the German nurses, every step into the American camp carried the weight of dread. They had been raised on stories that defeat meant degradation. Propaganda had painted the Allies as merciless, vengeful, and inhuman in their minds. The role of prisoner was synonymous with humiliation. Some whispered among themselves as they were led past the rows of tents, "They will use us like servants, or worse, they will forget us in the mud." One diary later, discovered in a confiscated satchel, captured the mood bluntly: "I must prepare for shame. Better to swallow it now than to be broken later." This expectation clung to them like a second uniform. They braced for insults, for the stripping away of rank and dignity. The Americans, too, assumed much the same. Guards joked in the chill night air that the nurses would be given menial work, perhaps scrubbing latrines instead of wounds. Even some junior doctors muttered that nothing good could come from letting Hitler's women near an operating table. The war itself seemed to promise no other outcome. By 1945, nearly 70% of German cities lay in ruins. Berlin endured daily bombing, its hospitals reduced to smoldering shells. Nurses had carried stretchers through firestorms, patched wounds with rags, and watched entire wards collapse under artillery. When captured, they carried those memories like scars. To be stripped further of professional identity felt inevitable. And yet, reality in the camp held a quieter rhythm. Before dawn, the German nurses were awakened by the metallic clang of American mess kits. They were handed black coffee, thicker than anything they had known in years, and bread that seemed extravagant compared to their rations back home. One woman recalled staring at the butter smeared across her slice, whispering to a fellow nurse, "This is more than we gave our own patients." Such small observations were exchanged like gossip, each note of abundance sharpening the sense of contradiction. The expectations hardened again as they were marched toward the medical tent. The smell of ether mixed with blood rolled out like a tide, and the women stiffened. Surely now came the moment of mockery, forced to watch, maybe even forced to clean, but never trusted to act. Their imaginations rehearsed scornful voices, hands pushing them aside. Instead, a silence greeted them. The Americans did not leer. They did not insult. They simply handed over aprons, masks, gloves. The nurses hesitated, glancing at one another, as though the gesture must conceal a trap. One raised her chin defiantly, clutching the fabric in her fists, prepared to refuse. But behind her, on a stretcher, a young soldier gasped for breath. His uniform was American, his face pale, blood soaking through the bandages at his thigh. The moment teetered. Here stood the expectation of shame, colliding with the reality of need. One nurse later wrote in her journal, "I thought they would crush us with words. Instead, they gave us silence. And the silence demanded more from me than any insult could." In that pause before she stepped forward, the full weight of war's paradox pressed in the defeated waiting to be broken. The victors waiting to scorn, and yet both waiting for life to return to a body stretched on the table. The audience knows what comes next, but for the women then, the tension was unbearable. the line between humiliation and recognition still thin as a scalpel's edge. The canvas flap of the operating tent lifted, and the nurses stepped into a world more foreign than any battlefield they had crossed. Electric lamps hummed above, their light stark against the shadows of dusk. Tables were already crowded with instruments, scalpels lined like bayonets, clamps glinting, sutures coiled in neat rows. The smell was thick, sharp with ether and sweat. Here, war had been distilled into one singular demand to keep a man alive for just one more hour. Major John Whitaker, sleeves rolled high, did not glance at the prisoners as enemies. His eyes fixed on the pale soldier stretched before him, chest heaving in ragged bursts. He spoke quickly, his words cutting through the fog. No politics, no waiting. We need hands. Scrub in, for the German nurses. It was a moment of collapse. Their rehearsed indignation, their bracing for insult, all fell useless against the suddenness of the order. One hesitated, her gaze locked on the instruments gleaming under the lamp. Another instinctively reached to smooth her apron, as though preparing for duties in a hospital back home. The roles they thought destroyed had been called back into existence in an instant. The first to move was Nurse Hildegard Kruger, 28 years old, who had once worked in a hospital in Dresden before it was leveled in February's firebombing. Her diary, later translated by American archivists, recorded her disbelief. I had stood in rubble, carrying children from flames. Now I stood among my enemies, tying on gloves. My body knew what to do before my mind allowed it. Whitaker nodded without ceremony, as though her compliance were natural. He handed her the scalpel with the same unspoken trust he gave to any American orderly. Others followed, drawn less by conviction than by the weight of inevitability. The patient on the table moaned, his blood soaking through field dressings, forcing the decision upon them, either step forward or watch him fade. What stunned them most was not the lack of derision, but the presence of respect. The Americans asked no questions of ideology, no words about the Reich, no accusations of loyalty, only commands anchored in urgency. Clamp, gauze, suture. The prisoners responded, their bodies recalling the rhythm of training. In that rhythm, fear loosened its grip. Outside, guards exchanged glances. They had expected protests, refusals, perhaps even sabotage. Instead, they saw German women bent over American soldiers with the precision of their profession intact. One guard muttered to another, "They look more like nurses than captives." It was a remark not meant for history, but the tension in his voice revealed the dissonance unfolding. By the end of that night, 3 surgeries had been completed with German hands assisting. Not a word about politics had entered the tent, only the steady beat of instructions, the hiss of suction, and the sighs of men pulled back from the brink. For the nurses, the experience was a fracture in certainty. They had expected to be diminished, stripped of worth. Instead, they found themselves necessary. That necessity carried its own kind of weight, heavier than chains. And so the reversal was complete. In place of humiliation, there was recognition. In place of disdain, there was trust, however fragile, in the quiet between surgeries. One nurse whispered to another, "We are prisoners, but in here, we are also nurses again." The operating tent had become a theater of contradictions. Outside, artillery still thundered in the distance, shaking the earth with reminders of enmity. Inside, however, silence reigned, the silence of concentration, broken only by clipped commands and the metallic clink of instruments. German nurses, faces masked and eyes focused, stood shoulder to shoulder with American doctors. What had begun as hesitation turned into a rhythm, as natural as breathing. A scalpel passed from German hand to American palm. A clamp clicked shut under whispered instruction. One nurse pressed gauze against a wound as the surgeon leaned in, sweat dripping onto his mask. At that moment, the patient's heartbeat faltered, then steadied again, and the tent seemed to exhale with him. For the Americans, the sight was unsettling. Private Charles Donnelly, a medic from Ohio, wrote in a hurried letter to his sister, "It makes no sense. These women wore the enemy's cross last week, and today they held the line between life and death for our boys. I don't know if I should trust them, but I can't deny what I saw. The Germans, too, wrestled with the dissonance. Nurse Hildegard recorded in her journal, "I held a man's arm as they stitched him. He called out for his mother in English. For a moment. I forgot uniforms, forgot nations. I was only a nurse, and he was only a son." The weight of those words lingers across decades, collapsing walls that propaganda had built for years. Around the camp, gossip spread. Guards told each other how a prisoner had calmly stemmed an artery when an orderly froze. Another soldier swore he overheard laughter in the tent, a fleeting moment when a nurse and an American anesthetist exchanged a joke about the stubborn hiss of a faulty machine. Such details, small and almost trivial, became fuel for disbelief. Was this alliance temporary necessity or a glimpse of something deeper? Statistics framed the paradox starkly. By May 1945, U.S. Army medical units had treated over 175,000 battlefield casualties in Europe. Without additional help, thousands more would have died waiting. The inclusion of German nurses, even a few hundred across multiple camps, tipped the balance. In some units, survival rates rose from 63% to over 70% within weeks. Behind those percentages lay faces, families, and futures, carried back from the edge by hands once labeled hostile. The emotional crescendo peaked in one scene recorded by a corporal's diary. An American surgeon barked suture and a German nurse stepped forward instantly, her hands steady, her posture unshaken. The soldier's chest rose, breath filling lungs that minutes before had faltered, for a heartbeat. Everyone in the tent paused. There was no Germany, no America, only the fragile rhythm of life reclaiming its ground. And so we must ask, if you had been there, what would you have felt? Relief that an enemy saved your comrade, or unease that your comrade's fate rested in enemy hands? And if you had been one of the nurses, would you remember the sting of defeat or the moment you held life steady with the enemy by your side? When the surgeries ended and the lamps dimmed, the nurses filed back to their quarters in silence. The wooden barracks smelled of damp straw and fatigue, but their thoughts were louder than any marching song they had once known. They had stepped into the tent as captives, prepared for humiliation, yet walked out having been addressed as colleagues. The psychological wall that had sustained them, the belief that Americans would treat them as subhuman, had cracked. Letters intercepted by American censors reveal the depth of this shift. One nurse wrote to her sister in Bavaria, "I was ready to be spit upon. Instead, they trusted my hands. I am afraid because I cannot hate them, as I was told I must." Such admissions were rare, but they appeared often enough to trouble even the intelligence officers who reviewed them. Hatred was supposed to be unbreakable, yet here it bent under the weight of shared humanity. Statistics underline this transformation. Of the 371,000 German POWs held in the United States by 1946, nearly 90% returned home, reporting fair or humane treatment. Among nurses in European camps, oral histories record repeated testimony. Respect in the ward left deeper scars of memory than defeat on the battlefield. These numbers tell us that ideology, though hammered into minds for years, was vulnerable to moments of compassion measured in heartbeats and breaths. The gossip in the barracks confirmed the strange reality. Nurses whispered about the American surgeons' calmness under pressure, about their endless supply of coffee that kept them awake through nights of stitching. One joked that the Americans ran their operating rooms like factories, producing life the way they produce trucks. Another confided she had never seen a black orderly treated as an equal in German hospitals, but here, in the American tents, she witnessed it. That single observation left her quiet for days. The Americans, too, changed in subtle ways. Guards who once sneered began offering extra cigarettes. A lieutenant confided to his logbook that watching the German nurses work made him think of his own sister, a nurse in Pennsylvania. They could be the same, he wrote, except for the flag on their sleeve. The wall of distance cracked on both sides. Of course, suspicion never vanished entirely. Some doctors still muttered that a wrong stitch could become sabotage. Yet, as the days turned to weeks, evidence told a different story. Men lived who would otherwise have died, and women once branded as enemies walked away with the quiet dignity of having saved lives. In breaking the psychological wall, both sides confronted an uncomfortable truth. The nurses realized they could not cling to hatred while tying sutures into enemy flesh. The Americans discovered that skill carried no nationality. Each operation was a hammer blow, striking against the iron bars of prejudice until they bent and warped. And now, I turn to you, the viewer. Imagine being in that ward, uniform on your shoulders, scalpel in your hand. Could you set aside the banners and anthems long enough to see only the patient before you, or would the wall of suspicion hold firm inside you? Even as a life bled out on the table, the war itself was collapsing into silence when the most enduring images were forged. By June 1945, German surrender was signed. And yet in scattered field camps across Europe, the strange collaboration in the operating tents continued. There, under the faded canvas stamped with the American insignia, German nurses moved not as captives but as healers, their gloved hands indistinguishable from those of the doctors beside them. One photograph, preserved in the archives of the U.S. Army Medical Department, captures the essence. A German nurse leans over a wounded soldier while an American anesthetist steadies the mask. Their faces are hidden by cloth, their uniforms blurred by aprons. Nothing in the frame declares victor or vanquished. Only their hands remain sharp in focus, poised together over the fragile body of a man caught between life and death. Symbolism pressed itself into every moment. These women had once sworn oaths under the banner of the Reich, promising loyalty to a nation that demanded obedience above conscience, now without ceremony. They performed a different vow to protect life under a flag they had been told to despise. The irony was sharper than any scalpel, yet it was also liberating, for in that tent, their worth was measured not by ideology, but by precision, steadiness, and compassion. Hildegard Kruger, the nurse from Dresden, described her transformation years later during an interview for a Red Cross oral history project, when I held a clamp in my hand. I forgot Hitler. I forgot surrender. I remembered only my training, and I remembered that pain is the same in every tongue. Her words encapsulate the shift from national identity to human identity, a shift that few would have believed possible at the war's brutal height. The gossip in the barracks began to soften into reflection. Nurses spoke less of humiliation and more of strangeness, how Americans asked them to teach wound-binding techniques learned in German hospitals, how surgeons praised their quick thinking during hemorrhages. One nurse admitted in her diary, "It was more respect than I received from some of our own officers." For the Americans. 2. Something lingered. Major Whitaker, in a letter sent home to Boston in July 1945, wrote, "They are still prisoners on paper, but when the gloves are on, they are my team. If war can do this, then perhaps medicine can do more than we imagine." His quiet speculation marked the symbolic oath that bound them all not to flags, but to the fragile continuity of life. And so the image remains, a group of women once marched into camp as trophies of war. Now, standing under an American flag that rippled above the surgical tent, they did not salute it. They did not claim it. Yet by their hands, they affirmed something larger than allegiance, the universal duty of healing. It leaves us with a question: when the battlefield dissolves and only the wounded remain, what oath matters more, the one sworn to a nation, or the one sworn silently to humanity itself? When the guns of Europe finally fell silent in the summer of 1945, history turned its gaze toward treaties, tribunals, and the rubble of cities. Yet beneath those sweeping headlines lived the quieter memories of a different kind of battlefield. In the glow of lamps strung across canvas tents, German nurses and American doctors discovered that the human body knew no enemy. That blood was the same crimson, whether it flowed from Ohio or from Dresden. It was in those moments, often unrecorded, that the paradox of war revealed its sharpest truth. On the battlefield, men were divided by uniforms. In the operating room, they were united by breath and pulse. The silence of the surgical ward punctuated by the hiss of ether, the click of clamps. The measured voice of command became a strange anthem, one that drowned out the slogans and banners echoing outside. Some of the nurses carried those memories home, tucked away like smuggled treasures. One would later recall that even decades afterward, when she closed her eyes, she still heard the steady rhythm of American rivet guns in factories and the quieter rhythm of sutures pulled tight in a tent. Another remembered not the bitterness of defeat, but the moment a stranger's life steadied beneath her hands. For them, war was not just a story of destruction. It was also a reminder that even in the darkest hour, human dignity can rise from unlikely places. And so the image endures the prisoners who became nurses again, the victors who saw not enemies, but partners, the patients whose survival was stitched together by hands that once served opposite flags. Perhaps the final lesson is simple. Nations may divide us, ideologies may harden us, but pain softens us, and compassion binds us. The oath to heal is older and stronger than the oath to hate.